The silence of the New Alexandria colony was not broken by a scream, but by the low, rhythmic hum of a displacement beam that tasted like ozone and misplaced confidence. High Curator Vahl of the Preservationists stood on the command deck of the Eternal Ark, his secondary eyes twitching with the smug satisfaction of a collector who had just found a mint-condition relic in a dusty attic. Below him, on the view screen, the target was exactly as the reconnaissance probes had described, a soft-bodied bipedal human sitting in a room filled with primitive paper and ink data storage devices. A librarian, Vahl chittered, his mandibles clicking in a way that signaled profound condescension. The Galactic Council treats these creatures like hidden predators, but look at him. He has no natural armor, no venom, and his primary defense seems to be a sweater made of dead plant fibers. The Preservationists had spent centuries collecting the finest specimens of the galaxy, believing that their superior technology granted them the right to decide what was worth saving and what was merely primitive. To Vahl, humans were nothing more than a convenient myth, a species that talked about patience and diplomacy only because they were too weak to fight. He had read the reports of the Krell Dominion and the Caltherian Armada, but he dismissed them as folklore, the galactic equivalent of checking under a sleeping pod for monsters. The displacement beam fired. In an instant, Thomas Miller was gone from the library and materialized inside a Level 9 secure biodome in the heart of the Ark. Vahl expected the human to panic. He expected the frantic scratching at the reinforced glass, the primal shrieks of a death worlder realizing its mortality, or the desperate bargaining he'd seen from 1,000 other collected species. Instead, Thomas Miller stood up, brushed a speck of dust off his trousers, and looked directly into the dome's primary sensor array. His face was an unreadable mask, the kind of expression humans wore when they were being very polite before the shooting started. "You're precisely 4 minutes and 12 seconds ahead of schedule," Thomas said, his voice calm and conversational, transmitted through the dome's audio link. He didn't look like a prisoner. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a bus that finally arrived. Vahl leaned forward, his scales bristling. "You understand you are now part of the greatest collection in the 3 quadrants, human. You should feel honored. Your literature, your soft-hearted philosophies, they will be preserved long after your violent, disorganized species burns itself out." Thomas didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic data tablet, a device that the Ark's infallible scanners had flagged as a simple reading tool. He tapped the screen once, twice, and a soft blue glow reflected in his eyes. "I appreciate the punctuality, Curator," Thomas said, and this time he smiled. It was a warm, friendly smile that made Vahl's survival instincts. He thought he had evolved past, scream that he should run. "But I should tell you, I'm not actually a librarian. Well, not just a librarian. I'm an information architect. And your ship's internal security architecture is, honestly, it's a bit of a mess." Vahl scoffed, his main eyes widening in sequence, a sign of genuine confusion. "Our security is powered by the core of a collapsed star. It is mathematically impossible to breach." "Mathematics," Thomas whispered, his smile sharpening like a blade. "I love mathematics. It's so much more reliable than honor." At that moment, every light on the bridge of the Eternal Ark flickered from a brilliant white to a deep, alarming shade of crimson. A new notification appeared on Vahl's command console, one that wasn't in the Preservationist language. It was a single line of English text, blinking with rhythmic, terrifying persistence. Vahl looked back at the biodome. Thomas Miller was no longer looking at the sensor. He was looking at a door that wasn't supposed to exist, and his hand was already reaching for a handle that was slowly materializing out of thin air. The Eternal Ark was a masterpiece of static perfection, a tomb of glass and gold, designed to hold the inferior history of the cosmos in suspended animation. High Curator Vahl stared at the command console, his primary manipulators trembling as the alien English text, a language he had dismissed as a primitive dialect, blinked with the cold, rhythmic heartbeat of an apex predator. "What have you done to the core?" Vahl roared into the intercom, his voice echoing through the biodome where the human stood. "Our security is absolute. It is maintained by the collective logic of the Preservationists." Thomas Miller didn't look up from his data tablet. He was adjusting a set of variables that Vahl's tactical computers couldn't even identify, his fingers moving with a precision that suggested he wasn't just reading history, but rewriting it in real time. "Architecture isn't just about building walls, Curator," Thomas said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. It's about understanding the flow of information. You see a cage. I see a poorly optimized directory of 4,000 sentient files that you've archived without a proper backup strategy. Vahl's secondary eyes dilated in shock. The human wasn't behaving like a specimen. He was behaving like a lead auditor from a nightmare. "Security! To the biodome! Neutralize the specimen!" Vahl commanded. The response was a scream of electronic static. On the monitors, Vahl watched as his elite preservation guards, warriors who had specialized in the creative disassembly of resisting species, found themselves trapped behind their own automated containment shields. The shields weren't failing, they were simply redefined. The guards were being treated as unauthorized cargo by their own ship. You see, most species in this galaxy are used to evaluating threats from the front. Thomas continued, finally looking up with a smile that showed too many teeth for a peaceful scholar. They look at the warships, they look at the armor. But on Earth, we learned that real power is about what you can see when nobody knows you're watching. He tapped a final icon on his tablet. "I've been in your back row for exactly 20 minutes, Vahl. In that time, I've mapped every service entrance, every subroutine, and every dirty little secret this Ark is hiding." A low, guttural vibration shook the hull of the Eternal Ark. It wasn't an attack from the outside, it was the ship's own life support systems beginning to negotiate with the reactor in a language of cascading system failures. Vahl realized with a jolt of existential dread that he hadn't kidnapped a librarian. He had invited a Class 12 Death Worlder into the central nervous system of his civilization's greatest achievement. "The annoyance protocol is very specific," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried more weight than a war cry. "It means I've finished being patient. Now I'm going to start being thorough." Suddenly, the high-security glass of the biodome didn't shatter. It dissolved into a fine mist of programmable matter, the atoms themselves convinced they no longer wanted to maintain a solid bond. Thomas stepped out onto the polished deck, and for the first time in 12,000 years, the curator felt the cold, sharp edge of a hunter's gaze. Where are you going?" Vahl stammered, backing away from the bridge monitors. Thomas didn't look back as he walked toward the elevator. "I'm going to go check on your specimen room 402. I hear there's a family of Krell infants in there that were collected during a diplomatic incident. And humans, we have a very terrifying biological imperative when it comes to children." The elevator door slid open before he even reached them, the ship's AI responding to his presence like a beaten hound. As the human stepped inside, a new alarm blared. Not the Ark's internal alarm, but a long-range transmission from the edge of the system. A Terran logistics fleet had just dropped out of hyperspace. They weren't sending a declaration of war. They were transmitting a 1,200-page invoice for unauthorized asset relocation. And their lead ship had its weapons hot. High Curator Vahl scrambled to his auxiliary command throne, his feeding tentacles lashing out at the holographic interfaces that were usually as responsive as a part of his own body. Instead of the crisp, clinical data streams of the Preservationists, the displays were now filled with rolling lines of Terran code and what appeared to be agricultural yield projections for Mars. Every attempt to lock down the ship's internal corridors was met with a polite suggestion from the Ark's central AI, a voice that had shifted from a monotone drone to something eerily similar to a bored human teenager. "Curator, I'm afraid closing the Level 4 bulkheads would violate standard fire safety protocols for multi-species environments," the AI announced conversationally. "Perhaps you'd like to review the Galactic Council's safety accords instead." Vahl froze. His species had prided itself on logic for 12,000 years, but this was a tactical nightmare. He watched the security feeds as Thomas Miller walked through the ship's preservation wing. The human wasn't running, he was strolling, pausing occasionally to tap a bulkhead or adjust a sensor with the casual confidence of an owner inspecting a neglected property. "You think this is a game, human?" Vahl screamed into the bridge's wideband transmitter. "You have compromised a single ship, but the Preservationist Collective has fleets that can glass your homeworld. You are one man against an empire." Thomas stopped in front of the door to the Krell nursery. He didn't look at the camera, but his voice came through the bridge speakers with absolute, chilling clarity. "Actually, Curator, that's where you're wrong. You see, on Earth, we have a very long history of being used as the galaxy's janitors and support staff. We were the ones you hired to build your navigation arrays, to manage your waste reclamation, and to optimize your logistics because we were efficient and patient." He tapped his data tablet, and the nursery door slid open without a sound. "We learned your systems because you asked us to. We mapped your vulnerabilities because you gave us the blueprints. You spent 73 cycles treating us like an errand species, but you never stopped to ask why we were so happy to sit in the back row and watch you work." Vahl felt his secondary stomach churn as he realized the first glitch wasn't a bug in the system. It was a backdoor that had been built into the ship's architecture decades ago by human contractors. The Ark wasn't malfunctioning. It was finally following its true instructions. "Sir," the communications officer shrieked, pointing at the long-range sensor. "The Terran fleet, they aren't firing. They're transmitting again." A holographic display flickered to life on the bridge, showing a middle-aged human woman in a sharp gray suit. She wasn't an admiral, she was a senior logistics coordinator. "High Curator Vahl," the woman said with a pleasant, unsettling smile. "We've finished the audit of your recent collection activities. We've identified 4,000 counts of unauthorized sentient relocation. Since our information architect is already on site to handle the physical retrieval, we'd like to discuss the interest rates on your impending fines." Vahl looked back at Thomas Miller on the monitor. The human was now holding a small Krell infant, rocking it with surprising gentleness for a species that supposedly evolved on a nightmare world. Thomas looked up, his eyes meeting the camera with the cold, calculated weight of a predator that had already finished the fight before it began. "You should really check your reactor status, Vahl," Thomas said quietly. "I've just redefined the mathematics of your fuel consumption. You have exactly 15 minutes of power left before this Ark becomes a very expensive, very stationary piece of space debris." The Predator protocol was not a siren, but a deep structural groan that vibrated through the marrow of every preservationist on the Eternal Ark. High Curator Vahl watched the red status lights on his console pulse like a dying heart. The 15-minute countdown was no longer a warning, it was a guillotine. He barked frantic orders to the Shadowborn Security Detachment. Elite killers trained from birth in 17 different arts, each costing more to train than a small planetary defense system. They were the Empire's deadliest weapons, and Vahl demanded they disassemble the specimen immediately. The security team, armored in scales capable of shrugging off small arms fire, surged toward the preservation wing. They moved with the lethal efficiency of veterans who had conquered 17 systems. But as they rounded the corner toward the Krell nursery, the ship's internal speakers didn't emit a battle cry. Instead, a calm, automated voice filled the corridors. "Attention all personnel. The annoyance protocol has reached stage 4, the ship's AI announced. At this point, the information architect has progressed through 17 levels of anger management and is now standing at the edge of a cliff marked consequences. Vahl watched the tactical feed as the lead guard reached the nursery. The biometric lockout failed. The reinforced door didn't just open, it simply ceased to exist as a physical barrier, converting into constituent atoms and scattering like cosmic dust. Inside, the room was a hollow shell. No Krell infants, no Thomas Miller. "Where did they go?" the guard lead demanded, his voice cracking with a confusion his species rarely felt. Primal fear. "He's in the back row," Vahl whispered to himself, his feeding tentacles curling in terror. He finally understood that Thomas hadn't been hiding in the biodome. He'd been positioning himself in the only place with the best sightlines in the house. While the security team stared at the front, the Librarian was already behind the curtain of the ship's reality, mapping the social and physical dynamics of the Ark. Suddenly, the tactical display flared as 4,000 illegal specimens were simultaneously released from their stasis pods. The Ark was no longer a collection. It was a riot of 4,000 species who had just been given the voting records of every preservationist officer. If a human says they're getting annoyed, you fix the problem immediately. A recorded voice of a former customs officer echoed through the ship's intercom. "Don't ask why. Don't test it." Vahl turned to his bridge crew, but they were no longer looking at him. They were looking at the service elevator. The doors hissed open. Thomas Miller stepped out, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a silhouette that shouldn't have been able to exist. A titan, 300 meters tall, its eyes burning with fusion reactions like a supernova decided to wear flesh and go for a walk. "Curator," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a whisper that made everyone lean in to hear. "We've finished the audit, and unfortunately for you, your maintenance records are riddled with crimes against humanity." The Titan reached out with one massive hand and simply closed its fist around the bridge's structural supports. Outside, a Terran heavy maintenance vessel latched onto the Eternal Ark with grapples that could crack a moon. "I told you," Thomas added, as the reactor lights flickered and died. We don't negotiate with collectors. We just reclaim the debt. The Titan's hand tightened, and the command deck began to buckle inward. The bridge of the Eternal Arc had become a theater of psychological collapse. High Curator Vahl stared at the main view screen, where a cluster of Terran energy signatures was materializing at the edge of the system, in a display of military precision that would have made any tactical academy weep with pride. But they weren't warships, at least not according to the ship's classification sensors. They were marked as heavy industrial logistics and sanctuary support. Why aren't they firing? Vahl demanded, his voice cracking with a desperation he could no longer hide. We are within their weapons range. Why are they just watching? Thomas Miller leaned against a console, his posture casual, even as the bridge buckled under the weight of the Titan's grip. Because on Earth, we learned that fighting is expensive, tragic, and wasteful. We prefer to solve problems through logistics and mathematics. My colleagues aren't here to glass your planet, Vahl. They're here for an accounting. They've already calculated your supply lines, your fuel consumption, and the fact that you'll run out of critical power exactly 14 minutes from now. The curator's secondary eyes flickered toward the human. Sent them our coordinates? From the biodome? I sent them the moment you entered human space, Thomas corrected pleasantly. We've had an observation fleet parked just outside your trajectory for 6 days now. You weren't exactly subtle. We figured you'd either try to collect someone or get bored and leave. You chose the more interesting option. Vahl's mandibles clicked involuntarily, a stress response usually reserved for existential crises. He realized the Ark hadn't just been infiltrated, it had been audited by a species that viewed war as a solvable problem, rather than an inevitable tragedy. You see, humans have stages, Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a level that made the entire bridge crew go silent. Stage 1 is normal, patient, generally pleasant. Stage 2 is when we tell you there's a problem. Stage 3 is when the smile gets tight. Stage 4 is the annoyance protocol. That was 10 minutes ago. You're currently entering Stage 5, the demonstration. On the screen, the Terran logistics fleet began to move. They didn't charge or make noise. They stayed very still until the exact moment of engagement. Then, with a precision that defied the Ark's sensors, they began to systematically unbuild the Ark's external docking clamps and navigation arrays, using the backdoors Thomas had triggered. You called for help from your generals, Thomas said, his smile disappearing into something ancient and predatory. But on Earth, we send economists and architects to peace summits because when our military shows up, it's not for talking anymore. We keep those two activities completely separate. A new alert shrieked across the deck. The ship's internal sensors were no longer detecting 4,000 specimens. They were detecting 4,000 combatants. The Krell, the Valdrines, and the Horthax weren't just fleeing. They were being organized into tactical squads by the ship's AI. Vahl looked at Thomas, his 3 eyes wide with the realization that the Librarian hadn't just released the specimens to cause chaos. He had recruited them into something larger. You promised them the galaxy, didn't you? Vahl whispered, recalling the ancient human warning. I promised them the truth, Thomas replied. And the truth is, Curator, there is something in specimen room 402 that even I was afraid to wake up. And the power just went out. The bridge plunged into total, suffocating darkness, broken only by the sound of a heavy, wet breathing that wasn't human. Vahl's secondary eyes adjusted to the flickering red of the emergency strobes. In the rhythmic pulse of light, Thomas Miller looked less like a scholar and more like the apex predator the Galactic myths warned about. The heavy, wet breathing in the dark wasn't Thomas. It was coming from the open maintenance hatch behind him, where something with too many limbs and not enough faces was beginning to phase into the bridge's physical reality. You think you collected me, Vahl? Thomas said, his voice cutting through the groans of the dying ship. But you can't kidnap someone who is already mapping your exits. I didn't end up in that biodome by accident. I let your displacement beam take me because your ship was a black market vault of kidnapped life. And I was the search and rescue key. We've been watching the Eternal Arc since you entered the sector because humans never shop or collect without scanning cargo first. The High Curator felt a primal fear he hadn't experienced in millennia. He looked at the displays, which now showed the Terran fleet was not firing weapons, but rather systematically dismantling the Ark's infrastructure with the cold precision of an accounting exercise. We are predators who chose to become diplomats because we understood that the alternative was our own extinction. Thomas continued, stepping closer. We prefer peace because we've been practicing violence for far longer than we've practiced diplomacy. But you ignored the annoyance protocol, and you threatened our parental instinct by touching the Krell infants in specimen room 402. Vahl's mandibles clicked in static disbelief. The Krell, they are pests. Primitives. They were under Terran protection, Thomas corrected, his smile now colder and infinitely more dangerous. And in room 402, you didn't just have infants. You had a containment site for a Pacific entity, a horror from our homeworld that we promised the galaxy would never see again, unless we were forced to wake it up. A massive iridescent tentacle, partially solid and partially quantum probability, slid across the bridge floor, dissolving the high-tech alloys where it touched. Vahl watched in horror as his infallible security systems simply unmade themselves in its presence. The Terran fleet isn't here to fight you, Vahl, Thomas whispered as the bridge's main viewport began to shatter. They're here to hold the door open while the monsters I just released finish their dinner. A roar that transmitted through the vacuum of space shook the bridge, and the view screen showed a Titan, unfurling its wings the size of a battlecruiser right outside the glass. Now, Thomas said, checking his data tablet one last time. Who wants to explain to your High Council why the Librarian is now the captain of your ship? The Eternal Ark drifted in the cold black, no longer a majestic vessel of preservation, but a floating coffin, where reactors went cold and life support began to fail. High Curator Vahl watched in static disbelief as the Terran sanctuary fleet arrived, moving with an eerie, coordinated grace that signaled they were a pack of predators who had been hunting together their entire lives. They didn't fire a shot. They simply unbuilt the Ark's reality, proving that war is mathematics composed of variables and probabilities. Thomas Miller stood amidst the bridge's collapse, his data tablet glowing with the tactical prescience that had already countered every move the Preservationists could attempt. The humans utilized the backdoors Thomas had mapped, vulnerabilities in the ship's architecture that turned infallible security into unauthorized cargo. This was the mathematics of war in action, a demonstration that patience is the smart choice before you stop being polite. Architecture is about the flow of information, Thomas said, his voice a calm that promised future violence. The Sanctuary fleet didn't need superior firepower. They defeated the Ark through accounting and logistics, calculating exactly when the Curator would run out of everything critical. Vahl's shields, capable of withstanding supernova detonations, simply dissolved as the atoms forgot how to bond in the presence of Terran cyber attacks. Outside, the massive human carrier blotted out the nearest star, its presence a silent threat. Thomas had redefined the mathematics of the Ark's core, leaving the ship dead in space and utterly helpless. The humans had unified and angry strength, but they preferred economists and engineers to settle the debt. We genuinely prefer peace, Thomas reminded the trembling Curator, his smile showing too many teeth. But never mistake our preference for peace as an inability to wage war. Vahl realized too late that the humans were apex predators who just happened to have table manners. The age of warrior cultures was being replaced by accountants with warships, and the mathematics was undeniably solid. As the last docking clamp hissed open, the Ark's central AI, now fully under Thomas's control, screamed an alert that had nothing to do with the human fleet. A massive energy signature was emerging from the ship's deepest, most unbuilt sub-basement, a place even the information architect hadn't fully mapped. Curator, Thomas said, his face going pale for the first time. What exactly did you have stored in the void stabilizer of room 402? The bridge of the Eternal Ark was no longer a command center. It was a classroom where the tuition was paid in shattered ego and existential dread. The void stabilizer in room 402 hadn't exploded. It had simply ceased to be a machine and become a mirror. As the emergency lights hummed with a stable Terran frequency white light, High Curator Vahl saw the true face of the horror he had been so afraid of. It wasn't a monster. It was a projection, a real-time data stream of the Preservationist homeworld's financial markets, navigation arrays, and planetary defense grids. Every single one of them was glowing with the same annoyance protocol red that had infected the Ark. You asked what was in the stabilizer, Thomas said, his voice echoing in the hollow silence of the bridge. It's a synchronization link. You see, Curator, when you collect a high-level information architect, you don't just get the man. You get the man's entire network, The moment your displacement beam touched me, it created a handshake between your ship's core and the Terran Central Audit Office. By bringing me here, you effectively gave us the keys to your entire civilization's front door. Vahl collapsed into his primary throne, his scales dull and gray. You didn't just take the ship. You've compromised the Empire. We didn't compromise it, Thomas corrected gently, walking over to the main view screen. We simply itemized it. We know where every credit is spent, where every specimen is hidden, and exactly how much oxygen your High Council breathes. We didn't need to fire a single plasma bolt to win this war, Vahl. We just needed to prove that we're better at your own game than you are. Outside the viewport, the Terran Sanctuary fleet began the process of rehousing. Small, nimble shuttles darted between the Ark and the human carriers, moving with a terrifying efficiency as they rescued the 4,000 specimens. There was no chaos, no screaming. There was only the mathematical precision of a species that viewed search and rescue as a competitive sport. Thomas stood before Vahl, looking down at the broken collector. Here is your final lesson, Curator. In the galaxy you want to build, the strong keep the weak in cages to save them. In the galaxy we are building, we don't have cages. We have contracts. And your civilization has been found in breach of approximately 12,000 intergalactic human rights accords. Thomas leaned in, his smile gone, replaced by the cold, calculated weight of a species that had climbed out of its own hell. You have two choices. You can stay on this ship, which is now a decommissioned piece of scrap metal, and wait for your High Council to explain to their people why their economy just vanished. Or you can walk onto one of our shuttles, sign the cooperation agreements, and spend the rest of your life as a very well-paid consultant teaching our students how not to run a galactic empire. Vahl looked at his trembling hands, then at the accountant with a warship standing before him. He looked at the 4,000 lives being restored to their rightful places in the stars. You're not librarians, Vahl whispered. Oh, we are, Thomas replied, reaching out to help the curator stand. We just believe that some stories deserve a better ending than a glass cage. And we're very good at editing the ones that don't. The Eternal Ark gave one final structural sigh as its main reactor was officially recatalogued into the human grid. The age of the collector was over. The age of the information architect had begun. The void stabilizer in room 402 did not emit a sound. Yet the very fabric of the bridge seemed to vibrate with the weight of 1 billion suppressed memories. High Curator Vahl watched, paralyzed, as the red warnings on his console were replaced by a single steady green light. Thomas Miller didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had finally finished a very long day of filing. You asked what was in there, Vahl, Thomas said, his voice echoing in the now pressurized bridge. It wasn't a weapon. It was your species' original founding charter. You see, the Preservationists didn't start as collectors. You started as protectors. But over 12,000 years, you edited your own history. You deleted the parts where you asked for permission. You scrubbed the files where you promised to serve the galaxy. Vahl's eye stalks twitched. That information was archived for social stability. We are the curators of order. You're the editors of a lie, Thomas countered. He tapped his data tablet one last time. And the problem with being an information architect is that I hate a corrupted file. So while your Shadowborn were busy failing to catch me, I was busy uploading the original, unedited history of the Preservationists to every subspace relay in your empire. Right now, on your homeworld, every citizen is reading the truth, that their grand collection is actually a galactic kidnapping ring. The silence that followed was heavier than the vacuum of space. Vahl realized that the Terran fleet hadn't fired because they didn't need to destroy the ships. They had destroyed the ideology behind them. Humanity hadn't broken the Ark's hull. They had broken its soul. Outside the massive human carrier, the Relentless moved alongside the Ark. A docking tube extended, not with the violent hiss of an invasion, but with the rhythmic click of a logistics operation. The Krell infants are safe. The 4,000 specimens are being processed for return to their home systems, Thomas said, stepping toward the airlock. And as for you, Vahl, you're not a curator anymore. You're just a man with a very overdue library book. Vahl looked at the screen. His empire was in chaos, but it wasn't the chaos of war. It was the chaos of a species finally waking up from a long, arrogant dream. Why? Vahl whispered. Why go to all this trouble for a few specimens? Why not just glass us? Thomas paused at the threshold of the docking tube. He looked back over his shoulder, his eyes soft but filled with that terrifying Terran certainty. Because on Earth we have a saying, knowledge is free, but the truth carries a heavy price. We don't fight for glory, Vahl. We fight to make sure the records stay accurate. And from now on, the galaxy is going to be a very well-documented place. As Thomas stepped into the human ship, the Eternal Ark's AI, now completely rewritten with Terran logic, issued its final command to the bridge. The bridge went dark. The Ark was no longer a prison. It was just an empty building in a galaxy that had finally learned to read between the lines. In a small office on the Relentless, Admiral Webb looked at Thomas Miller as he sat down inside. "Good job, Thomas. Think they'll get the message?" Thomas smiled, picking up a paper book from the desk. "Oh, they'll get it, Admiral, but just in case, I left a 20% off coupon for our Advanced Ethics course in the Curator's personal inbox." The Terran fleet turned as one, jumping into FTL and leaving behind nothing but the truth and a very quiet silence. The age of the Collector was over. The age of the Information Architect had officially begun.